to believe that you understand exactly or can predict exactly how that athlete's going to respond to your training, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks out. Well, first off, it's pretty naive. Secondly, I think you're selling your athlete short in that case, because essentially, rather than taking into account how they're adapting, their feedback to the program, their own individual responses to the training, you're just assuming that they're going to adapt like everybody else. And that violates the first law of training, which is the law of individual differences.
The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all one place, zorfitness.com. Next week of the Fitness Movement, I'm going to have Kyle Ruth back on the show. If people have been listening for a long time, they'll remember him all the way back on episode 23. I had him on, and we talked about athlete-centric coaching. This week, I'm actually going to be publishing that episode from back in COVID times. And next week, it'll be a good intro and reminder for, what's coming up, which will be a new episode with Kyle that's going to be publishing 1 week from today. So please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Kyle Ruth. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
So our conversation today, we want to talk about athlete-centric coaching, which I think is a term that you coined, and if not, it's cool. We're going to give you ownership of it anyway. But can you explain what that is to us really quickly here?
Yeah. So in my view, athlete-centric coaching is putting the athlete at the center of the program, as it sounds, right? So taking their needs, their feedback, their readiness, and building the program around that versus, what is typically done is, you build a program and you assume that the athlete's going to be able to adapt and mold themselves to the sets and reps and the rep schemes that you've created, right? So on the one hand, traditional coaching is like, it makes the assumption that athletes are robots, right? You give them X back squats at Y load, and you're going to get Z output.
Black
and
box.
The reality is, exactly. And the reality is athletes are humans, right? And they're going to do, you may give them X reps at Y load, and it's unlikely that the outcome is going to be predictable or repeatable, especially given all the other lifestyle factors that are involved, recovery factors. And if you're coaching someone in a sport like CrossFit, the reality is you're mixing a lot of variables into that training program. And so to believe that you understand exactly or can predict exactly how that athlete's going to respond to your training, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks out. Well, first off, it's pretty naive. Secondly, I think you're selling your athlete short in that case, because essentially, rather than taking into account how they're adapting, their feedback to the program, their own individual responses to the training, you're just assuming that they're going to adapt like everybody else. And that violates the first law of training, which is the law of individual differences.
Yeah, there's a lot of those programs out there. Like what I mean is like where it's some standard thing where you kind of roll it out and it's, you download the entire 12 weeks and then you go through it and you just follow the percentages, and each week it's 5 pounds heavier. And like that very rarely works for athletes, whereas isn't optimal for what maybe they could be getting out of it.
Sure. I think with novice athletes, you might be able to expect that they would be able to stick to that. And when I say novice athletes, I mean someone who's young. They're early on in their strength training career, early on in their energy system training career, and they're getting essentially newbie gains. And you can sort of expect to see that, 5 pound or 5% increase week on or every other week. But the reality is when you're working with people that are at levels that have gone beyond that, you're starting to see that adaptations to strength training when you're doing combined, concurrent strength and endurance training are just a little different. Sometimes you've fatigued the athlete with some of the energy system training you did in the preceding days, and you might need to back them off. You might need to institute a deload in order to get them to actually express some of the strength that you've built. I feel like fatigue sort of acts like a mask that prevents you from expressing strength. But sometimes volume is something that allows people to express their endurance a little better. So you're playing around with all these different variables, and I think part of the hallmark, or part of the advantage to using athlete-centric coaching is you just listen to your athlete where they say, man, I'm feeling a little weak right now. So maybe you dial back some of the endurance training volume or some of the energy system training volume and allow them to kind of express some of the strength training, or, some of their strength that they've already built up to that point.
Yeah. Once again, I even if you give the two athletes the same protocol, they're going to respond to it differently. So being able to, on a daily and weekly basis, see how someone's actually feeling, performing. Like, so for example, even if you gave one athlete an endurance protocol, they could feel super powerful in like a PM session if they did it in like the AM, whereas someone else just might feel like flat and not like they can produce any tension in that same session.
I'll tell you this. One of the things I found is that in general, athletes who like to do their endurance work in the AM, and say they prefer the way they feel when they do strength training in the PM, those are actually the athletes who I often need to get to do their strength training in the AM first, because they're the ones that tend to not adapt to their strength training as well. So I found that, almost across the board, that when people are like, man, I love waking up and getting a good, AM move and sweat in, those are the same athletes that often need their strength training to be the first session of the day, where they can, allocate a little more resources there. And then you get on the flip side, athletes who tend to be stronger already, they don't want to do.
Yeah. They want to just give me the weights.
Period. They don't want to do it at all.
Yeah.
Right. And so for them, trying to get them to do some AM wake up sessions and things like that can be a huge benefit for those athletes. Now, that's definitely true in the sport of CrossFit. In other realms where people are specializing, it's going to be a little bit different. But I think that's definitely true. When you analyze the demands of CrossFit, and you really are trying to mold the athletes' physiologies to be very adaptable for the sort of chaotic nature of the sport, oftentimes moving them away from what's comfortable is a really successful strategy.
Yeah. I mean, just as like a coach, if you give them the stuff that they haven't been doing before they came with you, it's like the easiest way that you can get them better at other stuff.
Always attack the low hanging fruit first.
Yeah. It's like, that's like the number one thing I do is like when I look at someone's like, when they come to me, I just look at their past training and be like, well, they haven't been doing like this category of thing. Like they didn't have any structured warm-ups. I'm going to start building that in. They didn't do any primer type work. I'll give them something like that. Like it's just like this simple stuff that they maybe had holes in.
Yeah. I think that's typically an easy way for athletes that are transitioning from, one stage to the next stage in their career, whether that's moving from, like moving into a sanctional bubble level or moving from sanctional bubble to games bubble. Oftentimes it's kind of just about finding what holes they had in their training, not just, holes they had relative to the sport of CrossFit. Yeah, maybe they weren't strong enough for the sport of CrossFit, but then going back and kind of, having a conversation with them. Well, how often were you doing, have you ever run a structured squat program? Have you ever run, a linear squat protocol? No? Well, maybe that would be a good place for us to start. Do you do, like you mentioned, any sort of like activation or primer work before you get started? No? Well, here's a simple routine I want you to do before we do any of our squat protocols. And just going back and kind of finding the little things that they may have missed or may just have gotten missed in their training, whether because it was like a really chaotic CrossFit, training program where they were like, okay, we have to make sure we do MGW, like hit those things throughout the week. There wasn't a ton of structure. So sometimes giving those athletes more structure can be really beneficial, or vice versa. People who came from super structured linear training programs, then starting to introduce them to more of the CrossFit chaos, and just kind of recognizing who needs what and when and where. That's one of the I would say one of the hallmarks of a really well balanced coach in the sport of CrossFit.
Yeah, adapting your methods to the athlete instead of just being like, hey, well, this is the way I do things and this is the way I think about the science or physiology of stuff, because again, it's not going to improve for them. Like it should be athlete centered.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's required to be more athlete-centric coach is just to have as many tools in your toolbox as possible so that you can work with meet the athlete where they are versus, the old adage, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Well, that would be a very unidimensional coach, and a coach who's capable of working in an athlete-centric environment. They're going to have, a drill, a screwdriver, a pair of pliers, and a hammer, and this whole other set of tools that they can kind of assess their athlete, meet them where they're at, and create a program that's based upon that athlete's needs. And then they can react to the way that the athlete is adapting to the program and make changes on the fly, rather than saying, all right, this is the only way, this linear squatting progression is the only way to get stronger.
For sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in terms of getting feedback from your athletes, obviously, like, it's the process of programming is only a process actually is going to work if you get really good feedback from your athletes. Besides just saying like, hey, this is the way to hit on this was the RPE, that sort of thing. What other things do you collect from your athletes on a daily or weekly basis?
So what I found over the years of coaching is that I'm looking at 4 primary biofeedback markers. The first is sleep quality. And I just ask people to rate their sleep on a scale of 1 to 10. For me, I know I need to get like 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep. If I get that much, I typically wake up and feel rested. But sometimes I get 8 hours of sleep and I wake up and I don't feel rested. So that would be low sleep quality. And I kind of instruct my athletes to give their score not based on the number of hours of sleep, but how recovered and rested they feel when they wake up. I found that to be a better marker of their sleep quality than just a straight hours. So 1 to 10 sleep quality. The second is soreness. And this should capture things like joint soreness, muscular soreness. And I just kind of use this to gauge, like, did we overshoot the volume in the last 2 days? If you did 150 wall ball and the next day your soreness is a 4, that's kind of to be expected. But if we had a training session that was exactly the same or a very small progression from the previous week, and your soreness jumps up, well, that kind of stands out to me. Something's going on. I might need to check in with you, and maybe we need to adjust your training for the remainder of the week. And then the other 2 that I monitor, which I think they're more psychological variables or less biological. And I think they actually have more bearing on whether or not someone should, institute a deload or how I'm going to respond to their training feedback. And that is their motivation for training. If what I see is over the course of a week or 2 weeks, I see motivation continue declining, to me, that's a really big red flag that we're either, the athlete is struggling with something. Whether it's, a conflict in their life that's preventing them from giving everything they can to their training, or if, they just are perceiving their training every day as, as an obstacle or something like that, or they're not particularly satisfied with the way that they're going into their training. That to me is a big red flag and likely going to institute a reactive deload, or at least at a minimum, a conversation with the athlete about how to approach the next phase of training. And then the final piece that I look at is training quality. And for me, that's just a basic subjective 1 to 10 score of how you think your session went. And I found that most athletes are pretty damn good at assessing their training quality. They get done with the session and they're like, man, that didn't go the way I wanted it to. I'm going to rate that a 6. Or, man, I absolutely crushed today. That's a 10. And when I go in and look, like, it's pretty accurate. And one of the things that I look for then is I tend to give people like a green, a yellow, or a red day. So based on their training quality, I'll mark in their training spreadsheet, they get a 10, that was green. They get an 8, that was green. They get a 6, that's a yellow. They get a 4, that's a red. And if I start to see multiple yellow days in a row, or multiple red days, or even one red day, I'm likely to institute a deload almost the next training block. So the next time I'm writing their training, I'll institute a deload. Or if I get a red day, I'm likely to just contact the athlete and be like, you're off for the rest of the weekend. Or movement work, do these spine saver routines, or, go through some sort of deload protocol for the rest of this week. Because I found that those are the things that if I, as a coach, ignore those red flags, if I ignore those 3 yellow days in a row, that's when the tweaks happen. That's when that's when things start to derail a little bit. And it's important to really pay attention to those things as a coach so that you can actually make sure that you keep your athletes on track for really long spans of time.
Yeah, very easily you can push through as, the programming perspective, or like just as the athlete be like, no, I'm fine. I can, push through this for another couple days or weeks potentially. Or, I mean, some people just do that indefinitely, but yeah, eventually your productivity just goes down.
Yeah.
Again, I think that's just a really smart way to do it, is just to think about like, what is the feedback that you're getting from your athlete, like subjective or whatever, like even the subjective markers, like they're probably like really, really strong correlates for any biological marker that you could find anyway. Like, if you have a good mood and you're kind of bubbly and wanting to interact in the morning and are like super like ready to train and everything, I guarantee your HRV is great.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. There's definitely there's research, but also just our own experience as coaches and working with humans. It's very clear that people that feel like shit tend to not be in a very good mood, and they're not very motivated to train. And people who have really high physiological markers, like their heart rate variability is high, or they're in a high state of readiness, they tend to come in and look like they're ready to just go crack the barbell in half. And I think there is something to be said for just asking the athletes and coaching them a little bit, educating them about how to provide that feedback accurately and how to be honest with their feedback. Because there are definitely people who will just, in their training quality, they'll just say it's a 10 every day. You know what I mean? And there's also people who will always they'll always rate lower. And as a coach, I think part of, being an effective coach is looking at that and seeing like, all right, this guy trends around a 6 to 7 training quality. He just tends to be a more negative person than, some of my other athletes. And it can be, it could be argued one way or the other, like being overly negative can be something that leads people to not see success, or maybe not. Maybe people that are overly critical and have that sort of like perfectionist mentality tend to rise to success. So I think there's, that's a whole nother conversation, but.
Yeah, that's what I do. I actually track athlete versus like their own scores week over week and like just look for the trends. So if they average at like a 6.5 maybe on like their session scores, for example, and like now they're at like a 4.5, even though like a 6 might not have been a great average for somebody else. If they're at a 7 that the next week, that looks good, versus someone else that averages at an 8.5 and now they're at a 7, they might need a deload. In my mind, I think looking at their trends, because it's really hard to calibrate a subjective number.
So it's very, very challenging to take any one of those. So I'll say this, as a coach, I would never take any one single metric and be like, oh, your motivation's a 6 today, I'm going to automatically deload you. Like, that's not something that I would do. What I do is I look at the trends. And I think we can get a lot more information from looking at those trends over time, just like you would with heart rate variability, right? So HRV, you wouldn't look at like my heart rate variability. Some days is like 200, 220. You wouldn't look at that. You'd look at that and be like, oh man, you're an elite endurance athlete. Well, first off, no, I'm not. Secondly, you might look at it another day and it would be like 120. And you could, if you looked at any one of those, you'd be like, oh man, 120, that's a pretty high heart rate variability for a 35-year-old CrossFitter. And if you knew that my average was closer to that 200 mark, then you'd be like, oh man, that's actually super low. You should probably go take a nap.
Yeah, go chill out for a little bit. Yeah, and again, that's like one of those things that's, you can change your HRV fairly easily.
Yeah. Like that.
For sure. Just based on even like, if you just do like a simple like breathing protocol that's like a elonged exhale, it can very easily, you can improve your scores within a couple of minutes dramatically.
One of the things that I think is most interesting that I'm sure you've probably heard of it, the mammalian diving reflex.
Mm-hmm.
If you submerge your face in cold water, heart rate variability will shoot through the roof. It's a crazy, like, that's one of the things that, my athletes who rely on their Whoop to give them a lot of information, I'm like, it's a good wearable, right? I like the metrics that we get. I love the sleep tracking, but keep in mind that all of these things they're just a proxy. They're just a proxy for recovery. And I'm as interested in your subjective assessment of how you feel as I am in what your Whoop says, or maybe more interested in your subjective assessment than what your Whoop says.
Yeah. And this is coming from someone who's got a ex-phys background, by the way.
Yeah. And I also am wearing my Whoop right now.
Right.
Just to be clear.
Yeah. That's super interesting. I don't know if I've specifically thought about the dive reflex in that way before, but I've definitely, like, during static apnea, just like holding my breath, you can tell that there's a bigger difference between your beats, like, because you can hear your heart rate or your heartbeat when you're holding your breath a lot easier. And you can literally tell the difference in the beats if you pay attention to it.
Oh, if you want to really hear your heartbeat, get in a sauna and do some static apnea work. And it will be like someone is beating one of those big, giant bass drums. You can hear it so clearly. I've always been curious why that is. I don't know if it's that the heat is, creating some sort of vasodilation. And so you're hearing the flow of blood through, in your inner ear canal or something like that. But it's very clear that the combination of heat plus static apnea, you can hear every single heartbeat in your body so clearly.
Yeah, we're just underwater. It's the same thing. If you, like, submerge your ears underwater, you can definitely, same thing. Interesting side silo. We'll leave that there for now. And one of the things I want to talk about is preparing for competition, because we're getting close to the Open. This will probably release right before the Open comes around. So athletes are really going to be gearing up for this. One of the big jobs of coaches is to prepare their athletes for competition. So with comp prep coming up, a lot of a coach's, programming, a lot of the stuff that athletes are doing in their off season or more physiological based, where it's, trying to improve the systems that will allow for a better performance on game day, but it's ultimately just a system and it's not actually the performance itself. And oftentimes there's a gap in the middle there that we need to close as competition rolls around. So how do you think about preparing an athlete for competition to be able to express their capacities and, like, building confidence in their abilities and their capacities?
For sure. So I think essentially the way I look at it is there is a separation between, let me back up. First off, that the fittest athlete does not always win. Now, you can look at Matt Frazier and say he's probably the fittest athlete, but what Matt really has is he has a very high level of fitness, whether you want to call that VO2 max, strength, whatever it is. He has these fitness qualities that are extremely high, but he also has extremely high movement economy, right? So he moves very efficiently in everything that he does. In fact, when you watch him next to, other elite athletes, you can even see the difference in how efficient his thrusters are. Watch his deadlifts from the Damn Diane event from, the online games, and then watch some of the other athletes. And it's just, there's no ounce of wasted movement in there. So that's fitness, but it's movement economy. And then he has the ability, has the psychological tools to be able to use them in a game day scenario. So there's those three pieces, right? It's an interplay between your mental or psychological abilities to be under the lights and be able to perform. It's your level of fitness and then how efficient you are at expressing those things. And I think that's really what we're trying to do when we're getting closer to a game day scenario. So here we are, a couple weeks out from the Open. What can you do, right? Well, you can work on the psychological side, right? To me, there's a couple of different ways to do that, but the best thing you can do is game day rehearsal. And that to me means recreating the competition environment, with this being the Open, as close as possible. So film your workouts, have a plan going in, write down your sets and reps and your braking structures. Have a judge, have someone who's actually going to no rep you when you have a legitimate no rep. That way, when you show up on game day and you get that no rep, you know how to psychologically deal with it much better. And going through this dress rehearsal will also help you prevent getting those no reps on game day, because if you normally train in an environment where no one's telling you that you're not going to depth on your wall ball, and all of a sudden you have a judge and you're in the Open and they're like, no rep, no rep, no rep, you don't want that. You don't want the Open or your competition to be the first time that you're squatting to depth as a result of that. So I think the first thing that people can do, and Matt has clearly done a great job of this, is in his training, in competition prep, recreate that competition environment as close as possible. And I think it's most easy to do in a qualifier scenario. What does it require? A little bit of planning, a workout that was unknown until a day or two before, right? You could use the training think tank throwdowns that we release on Thursdays and plan on doing it on Saturday. Download our competition manual, which gives you a template for planning out your workout. Plan out your nutrition, your warm up, exactly like you want to do on game day, and then walk yourself through it. The more you practice doing that, dealing with an unknown event, planning for an unknown event, being, in an environment with a judge, the better you're going to be able to handle it on game day. So to me, that's probably the most important thing that you can do, right? Is train in an environment that recreates competition day. So that would be number one. Number two, I think would be to work on movement economy. If what you've done at this point is really hammer your training, right? So you developed your energy systems, you built your VO2 max, you raised your lactate threshold, your 1RMs are all up, you've improved your CP battery scores, every metric, your max rep muscle up, your max rep strict handstand push-up are all better. The only thing that you have time left to do at this point is to make those things a little bit more efficient. So how would I go about doing that? I would watch elite athletes that have similar body proportions to me. If I'm 6'2", I'm going to watch Brent Fikowski, because it turns out watching Matt Frazier, who's arguably 5'7", 5'6", I'm sure there's some debate in his mind about his height, or like Noah, he's solid 5'8", right? Don't watch those guys. They don't move the way that you do. Watch people that are elite athletes that are, similar anthropometrics to you. Or if you are someone who's 5'7", then watch Matt and watch Noah, right? So take those things and watch their videos, and then get an empty barbell out and try to recreate what they're doing, and get as close to reverse engineering elite mechanics as you possibly can, because those little things, those little changes in your movement economy are going to go a really long way in improving how much of that fitness, that VO2 max, lactate threshold, strength, CP battery, muscular endurance, all those things, it'll improve how much of that you can actually use in a competition environment, right? So that would be layer two. I would call that deep practice. Monkey see, monkey do, right? And then the third piece is to develop your mental toolkit. And to me, the things that I have found to be effective would be meditation is probably the most effective out of all of the things that I have played around with. And I think there's two kinds of meditation that I think would be most effective. The first would be focused attention. And I've talked about this. I've posted on my Instagram. I've talked about it on the Corpus Animus podcast. But the best test is just try to sit quietly for 10 minutes and count your breath, right? In is 1, out is 2. And anytime your mind wanders away from that simple breath count, start back over at 1. And your goal is just to get to 10, say 3 times in 10 minutes. And the average person, most of the CrossFitters that I work with, myself, pretty much everybody I've ever talked to, if they haven't practiced some form of mindfulness meditation, there is no chance that they can make it to 10 without getting distracted by any thoughts or anything else other than the breath in that 10 minutes. Now, how does this relate back to your fitness, right? Well, we're talking about let's just say you have a 10-minute AMRAP, right? And that 10-minute AMRAP is thrusters and chest to bar, 2 movements that require quite a bit of attention. And you need to be able to move that attention around. At some point, you need to be focusing on how you're moving the thruster. Then you need to be monitoring your body. What does your heart rate feel like? What does your breathing feel like? What do your legs feel like? Am I going a little bit too fast? Is this pace in the right spot, right? So then you have this that's focused attention. And what I want to try and get people to do is spend time outside of their training. It's free. Just counting your breaths, learning to focus your attention in one place. And then the second piece is trying to take that focused attention that you've developed at rest in a quiet environment and start to take it into a more chaotic environment. Sit on the assault bike, hold 200 watts. Now start counting your breaths, right? Spend 2 minutes counting your breaths. Then spend 2 minutes focusing only on your wattage, nothing else. Hold that 200 watts. Then spend 2 minutes focusing only on the sensations in your body. How do your legs feel holding 200 watts? How does your breathing feel holding 200 watts? Don't count your breaths. How does it feel? And rotate your attention back through those different things. So what you're doing is you're learning to control where you're putting your focus at any given moment. And I can guarantee you that the best athletes in this sport are spending time learning to put their attention where it matters.
I definitely think that the attention thing is probably something that people don't realize is inhibiting them nearly as much as it does. Like, it is really challenging to be able to focus for a max unbroken set of double unders on sort of nothing almost. It's just like having this like sort of vague hovering attention of, I'm able to focus on my body moving and being in the right position, but not like, super focused where it's going to trip me up and I'm analyzing how I'm doing. Because then as soon as you do that, it kind of shifts you away. And being like present, like in that instantaneous moment, it's definitely a learned skill.
Is called open monitoring. It's another type of meditation where essentially what you're doing is you're monitoring all aspects of what's going on around you at one time, right? That's like the double under thing, right? Because you have to pay attention to your rhythm. You have to pay attention to your jump height. You have to pay attention to your breathing, but you don't want to let your attention get sucked into any one of these
things. Right,
things.
because if you focus on one of those, all of a sudden your timing is off and then you trip. Whereas in a different movement, that might not be a good strategy. For example, if you're thrusters, it's always the case where you get pulled onto your toes. It might just help for you to focus heels down the whole time.
Yeah. A simple thought I use for myself is pull the bar down, right? Mm-hmm. That way I have more control over where the bar is coming down to my shoulder every time. As long as I focus on pull the bar down, it gives me a better eccentric. My movement feels a little more fluid. I think my rep cadence stays a little bit higher doing that. But same point. If you think about what most people's experience during double unders, right? So let's say they're doing 100 double unders in the open, right? So they're doing double unders and they're going double under, double under, double under, and their judge isn't counting. So then their mind's like, man, I'm kind of pissed off. My judge isn't counting. I really wish I knew what rep I was on. And then the judge is like 25. And they're like, oh man, I had 28. So like, that's where their mind is. And then they trip and they're like, oh shit, I'm so tired, right? Versus someone who can just stay present, stay focused on what they're doing at the moment. But like we said, be, more of an open monitoring where it's not this like ping pong mind where they're just doing double unders. I think, if you're in a short time frame leading into the open, you can make it, if you've never spent any time dealing with or improving your ability to focus, man, you've got a lot on the table that you can work on in the next few weeks leading into a competition event.
Yeah, and you can even visualize the actual tests that you plan on doing, or even if it was just a training session. Like I have a 10-minute AMRAP in my PM session of thrusters and double unders, like a 19.5 scenario or 17.5 scenario, and you could sit down and visualize that and just focus on visualizing rounds of that, and likely it's the same sort of focused attention thing that's going to be super helpful.
Absolutely. One of the things that we just discussed in the classroom was this book, How the Body Knows the Mind. And one of the things that she talked about in there was the power of rehearsal. And it turns out that the mind doesn't really differentiate from things that happen outside that actually happen to our body and what happens inside of our mind. The best case in point is a dream. I had this terrible dream once of a bear chasing me around. I woke up, my heart rate was 150 and I'd been laying in bed. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. Physiologically, my body responded to that threat in the same way that my body would have responded if I was sprinting away from the bear down the trail. So, one of the advantages could be doing mental rehearsal. It's not quite as good as physical rehearsal. The best thing in my mind is the open workouts released on, I don't want to give away all my secrets, but the open workouts released on Thursday, and then Friday morning, the thing you should do, right, is go get that empty barbell or that light dumbbell and literally walk yourself through the workout. Play out your equipment setup, how you're going to transition between movements, walk through the whole thing. And that right there doesn't have to be fatiguing. It doesn't have to be at game pace. Just grease the groove with the movements, walk through it. Man, that will go a long way in improving how you game plan. You'll understand the workout so much better conceptually by doing that than you would if you just wrote down sets and reps on a piece of paper. So when I say plan, we have this competitor's manual, and one of the things it talks about is visualization and walkthroughs. And when I say plan, that's really what I mean is like sit down and really imagine how you would operate in the workout. How's this workout going to go for you? And then develop your plan after you've spent that time kind of walking yourself through the workout. Contrast that to watching the demo people and being like, I'm going to do what they're doing, right? That's never worked out well for me. That's for sure.
Yeah. They always well, not always, but they normally redo and smash their scores, even not in that like super high arousal environment, even if they're just like in their own gym, training on their own. Yeah, they're still able to do better just because they're able to, think and plan ahead and have one attempt under their belt too. But basically, like if you do a little walkthrough like that, it's basically like when you go to actually test for the first time that you're almost doing a retest where you're at an advantage, like you've kind of felt it out already one time. Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that's super important, and I think the meditation helps with this, but I'm thinking there's other things as well that would definitely be advantageous that you could focus on from a coaching programming perspective, is teaching athletes how to regulate their autonomic nervous system. So like basically you can think of this as like your level of arousal when you go into an event. So like one might be like sleeping where you're super calm and relaxed. 10 might be like you're getting shot at. Like
that bear that was chasing me.
Yeah, the bear chasing you in your dream. Yeah, great example. How do you help athletes think about regulating arousal? What tools do you help provide them with so that they can actually do that based on the event demands?
What I tend to do with my athletes is a long way before the competition, way before. I introduce some really basic breathing techniques. One would be box breathing, right? So box breathing to me is, you get into a relaxed state and you inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. And I just say, set a 10-minute timer. When you're done with your training, I want you to go through this box breathing, keep it all nasal. There's some argument about nose inhale, mouth exhale, but I'll just leave it. I keep it simple, right? I like to keep things simple. And just go through that process and just get familiar with your breathing. Keep your hands on your diaphragm. I want you to feel some diaphragmatic breathing. Then after a little while, I have them start extending the exhales and extending the holds, right? So something that will, help to downregulate them a little bit after training. And we're starting to get, take advantage of some apnea as well with the breath holds. So have them start messing with that. Some other things that I tend to do are like, I prescribe, the assault bike focused warm up that I was talking about. I'll give people something like that, where it's like, all right, I want you to spend 10 minutes on the assault bike, hold a very steady wattage. And what I want you to do is I want you to nose breathe only and count your breaths, right? So the combination of that, of, paying attention, nose breathing already extends out the exhale a little bit. Maybe we get a little benefit of boosting CO2, blood CO2 levels and some vasodilation from that. And they're getting some attention, focusing their attention on something. So even that, it's a tool that they're getting used to using on a frequent basis. And so those are things that they can kind of rely back on and have practiced now. So we usually start doing that as soon as they start working with me. And so that might be, 10 months of practice with these two tools. And then as we get closer to the open, then I can start to talk to them about, all right, if you're, you're in the more of a live event thing, but if you're in the warm-up area and you're feeling overly anxious, right? Simplest thing for you to do. Remember that focused attention breathing that we did on the assault bike? I want you to go over there and do that. So go on the assault bike, 5 minutes of focused attention breathing. They know exactly what they're doing. And they get off of it and they feel much more confident because they've been in control of something for a while. Or you just got done with an event, you're pretty fired up because maybe it didn't go the way you wanted it to. Let's have a conversation about it. Now, why don't you go do some box breathing with that extended exhale? So they have these tools that they have practiced with for extended periods of time that provide them with like almost a grounding that they can go back to or use before an event to change that. I'm curious. I know you've spent a lot of time investigating breathing and some of the influence on the autonomic nervous system. Are there specific tools that you use with your athletes? I'd love to learn more.
It was bizarre as you were talking because I like do all the same stuff for my athletes. Like I have people sit on the assault bike and hold a certain inhale, exhale ratio, like maybe 2 second inhale, 3 second exhale or something on the assault bike where they're going to stare at the monitor the whole time, focus on that. I'll have them do box breathing. I'll have them do some sort of apnea work in the morning sometimes. If I have an athlete where they can swim, that's a great one because you can't swim when you're underwater. So or when you're actually underneath the water, when your head's under the water. Yeah. So like, and all that stuff helps. Like if you're able to regulate and not freak out, basically, to put it in simple terms, when you're in an apnea scenario, when you're in the water, when you're holding a certain wattage on the assault bike or in a workout that's pretty tough, and you're able to just kind of deal with the discomfort, like the ability for you to be able to stay calm when a workout gets really intense, or if there's like a big crowd, all this stuff that's a little bit more out of your control in a competitive environment, I feel like that just is a massive advantage.
Well, to me, that stuff's all related back to breathing, right? So your ability to stay calm in a competitive scenario, if you watch someone who's calm next to someone who is in a really like maybe over aroused state, um, well, just watch them. Watch their respiration rates. The person who's calm is going to have very calm breathing. Maybe they're sitting there and nose breathing. They might take, some deeper breaths here and there. The person who's in that overly aroused state, man, their respiration rate is going to be through the roof. They won't even notice it. You know what I mean? It's going to feel like they're just breathing. Eyes might be a little wider. The sympathetic system is going to be all fired up. And it's so interesting that to see how much that learning to tolerate hypercapnia, elevated CO2, learning to tolerate variances in breathing, how much that can really play a role in people's ability to control their arousal. And, so on that topic, I think there's another thing that's probably really important to discuss there. And that's just the fact that I think a lot of people need to learn to be able to put their arousal into context. So talking a little bit about competition anxiety. So everybody, and I've yet to meet an athlete who doesn't experience some heightened state of arousal before competition. But I have very clearly witnessed athletes who put that into context and say, man, I'm excited to go crush this event. Whereas another athlete is experiencing the same level of arousal, but what they say is, man, I'm so scared, right? They're both at very high levels of arousal, but one is on the positive side, right? Excited, amped. They use different language to describe what they're experiencing, even though it's the same experience. And the other person is describing it as fear, anxiety, dread. There's nothing worse than going in. I know this from my own personal experience, and I'm sure you've had this as well. But there's nothing worse than going into a workout that you're dreading and dreading it at level 10 arousal, right? Like, God, nothing worse.
For sure. Yeah. Physiologically, it's like the same thing that's going on. And there's nothing like you prepared for however many months of your life or potentially years of your life where like, this is like your moment. There's no other way around it. Like you're not going to think your way out of it. It's not like an important thing. Like it is a big event. You're going to have physiological changes that happen in your body, which make you feel either that anxiety, stressed out feeling or amped up, fired up, whatever you want to call it. Like I feel like it is really the same systems that are turning on. It's just a matter of how you're interpreting them and how you can harness them.
There's some interesting research that just changing your posture, we should both do that right now, actually. Sit up real straight, shoulders back, right? Just changing your posture a little bit can change the way that you interpret those states of arousal. So putting a smile on your face, even if the old fake it till you make it, simply putting a smile on your face, sitting up straight, pulling your shoulders back, holding a champion's posture when you're experiencing those feelings of enhanced arousal, that right there can go a long way in changing the way that you're putting those feelings into context. So there's something to be said to the old fake it till you make it kind of adage with that.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever like have athletes experiment with other ways that they can prep themselves to have the same physiological responses in competition that they might have in training that they might have in competition? For example, like dosing them with like caffeine or like a stimulant of some kind, or like blasting music or any of that sort of stuff. Do you use any of those tools?
So when we were talking about recreating the environment, one of the things that we've done at our games camp, so this isn't something that I would do with someone who's just trying to compete in the open, right? This is when we're trying to take things to a level that this is their job or their livelihood, right?
Right.
So things would be like forced sleep deprivation, right? It's really common at the CrossFit games. It sounds terrible, sounds like you're being a dick, but you're not. What you're really doing is you're preparing them for the environment. So, making them show up at a trail when it's cold, show up at 5:30 a.m. for a trail run, like that kind of stuff. Yeah, we're definitely, I don't want to give away much more than that, but yeah, we're definitely doing that. Blasting music for sure, right? Making music so loud you can barely hear your judge. That kind of stuff definitely is happening. I think those are the types of things. And even using like assault bike sprints or something like that to make people feel more fatigued than they would want to feel going into an event, simply so they're used to feeling that level of fatigue, the day 3 fatigue. And, sometimes making them push through things that they wouldn't normally want to, or wouldn't make sense from a training adaptation perspective, but makes sense for them to have experience with that level of fatigue and still being able to continue moving.
Anything you can do that is going to simulate how you're going to feel in that moment of competition, recreating the environment. Yeah, I mean, all that stuff, it's just another way to gain experience without necessarily having to go through the competition process itself. It's almost like you get to compete without having to compete.
The one advantage to it, I think, is that you gain the experience, but you're in a controlled environment where if you get a tweak or something starts to not feel right, or you see your athlete starting to get really run down, you can pull them out of an event and there's no repercussions to that, right? So it's like the beauty as a coach is you are recreating the competition environment, but there's you're in control of the environment, right? So you can just be like,
you're not Castro.
Yeah, if your hip's hurting, let's just back you off of this next one, or let's modify the next workout, or go have the massage therapist work on your hip, and we'll come back and we'll do the final event for today. So you're in control, and I think that's one of the beauties of using those competition simulations, is that really in the end you're in control of the environment and building experience in a way that can build confidence in the athlete versus shattering their confidence by, just taking them to a competition where they might not be prepared.
Mm-hmm. Remember, like, Michael Phelps' coach would like break his goggles, or not like regularly, but like he had done that before. And at some point he made them show up late to the airport, or just like little things like that, just like throwing them off, so that when things didn't go correctly, like quote correctly on competition day, that he wouldn't respond negatively to those things.
Yeah. He's dealt with it before.
Right. Yeah. I think that's the bottom line, is prepare yourself to deal with all the stuff, all the stressors that you're going to have to deal with on your competition day. I'm sure you see that certain athletes are like gamers, where they, really enjoy the aspect of competing. They compete at a higher level than they train. So in other words, if they're able to get 180 calories on their 10-minute assault bike time trial in a max effort training scenario by themselves in the gym, they might be able to get 200 or 210 in a competitive scenario if it's under the lights, for example.
For sure.
Is there anything that you'd help people to try to gain that mentality of like, when the lights are on, when everything's on the line, I know I can get to that next gear, so to speak?
So you're talking about athletes that are more trainer, like that type of athlete, where they're really good in a training environment, but they struggle more when they show up to a competition environment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think those athletes are the ones that benefit the most from these types of competition simulations, because then they start to learn that they can always put out the same level of performance that they show, like that they typically show in a training scenario. I think that's one of the things I'll give you a simple example. Noah is an athlete who he really shows up on game day, where Travis is like the ultimate trainer, right? And so if Noah goes into competitive scenarios too frequently, then he performs really well in those competitive scenarios in training, but it kind of burns him out because he really does call on something a little bit deeper. Whereas Travis can kind of just access that anytime he wants, but sometimes has had a harder time getting, putting that out when he shows up on game day. So I think for someone like Travis, the advantage is going in and doing those competition scenarios and competition simulations more frequently, or using training partners in training so that he can leverage that. And with Noah, it's learning to gain access to be able to do that by himself sometimes, especially if it were like a, online CrossFit Games scenario, right, or a CrossFit Games where there's no spectators scenario, right? Yeah. Like those are scenarios where Travis, I think, would really thrive typically. And I will say this, I think we did a really good job of preparing Noah for that that game scenario with some of the CrossFit Games prep camps that we did. I think we did a pretty good job with that. But yeah, that's my take. Is if you're someone who always does really well in training, but maybe sometimes struggles to show up on game day, those competition scenarios or simulations are your go-to. Maybe get a training partner who's slightly better than you, so that you're used to chasing someone rather than being the one that wins all the time.
Mm-hmm. Do you have athletes who are like enjoy the training process, do better in training scenarios, like Travis, like you were saying in this example, who don't want to compete that much? And what does that conversation go like if they have competitive aspirations and they want to compete at the highest level they can, but they don't necessarily want to compete as frequently?
That's not something that I've run into too much. It seems that most of the people that I work with want to compete all the freaking time. Like they just want to compete in training every day. And I almost need to like hold them back from.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely was the other way too, where sometimes people want to compete all the time and you got to pull back the reins. Like, hey, you're competing way too often. You're going to compete your way out of shape, basically. You're
going to burn yourself out. That's what's really going to happen. If you compete that frequently and you're leveraging the cortisol and adrenaline all the time to get that much out of you, then yeah, you're going to burn yourself out. And that's more the scenario that I've dealt with the population of athletes that I work with. People who just want to go ham all the time. They want to know what everybody else's score was on every other Metcon. And I find that as much of a challenge, where it's like, no, we're in a training phase. We're trying to build your lactate threshold. You need to stick to your paces. Ignore what they're doing. You stick to your paces. And, now we're, given where we're at in the season, now we're starting to transition away from that to more performance-based stuff where they do have other people's scores and things like that. So now they're starting to really enjoy what they're doing versus stick to your pace.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see what the games athletes say after the events, like when they do those little interviews, because a lot of them are just like, yeah, I wasn't really looking around. I was, staying focused on what I needed to do, like, staying basically just like holding my own pace, that sort of thing, which is exactly what you're saying. And that's the case where a lot of the time in certain events, you're better off just like ignoring everybody else around you.
Yeah, I think most events you benefit from staying in your lane, right? Just keeping your focus on yourself. I've always found, just personally, the only experience that I have is my own experience. And in competition, anytime I like pay attention to someone else and I'm like, all right, I'm going to get on the bar before they do, that's when I miss my lifts. Right. And if I just would have, stayed in my own lane and done my thing, I'd have hit my lifts and I probably would have ended up beating them in the end. But as soon as I start to get into this hyper competitive mindset in a competition scenario, that's when I make mistakes. And there's something to be said for racing, right? Mm-hmm. Or if you're in command of a workout, regulating your pace based upon the rest of the field so that you can ensure that you get the victory. There's something to be said for that. But that still means that you're in command and paying enough attention to yourself to know that you're going to be able to have that finishing kick at the end. It also requires a lot of competition experience, enough to know that you have the kick at the end and that you have the confidence in your kick to be able to beat the guy in the lane next to you. Those are all things that require like lots of experience, whether developed in actual competition or competition simulations.
Yeah, the whole scenario of where you have multiple events, multiple days, it's the marathon row and I'm in 5th place. It's not worth the energy to try to catch the 4th place person. And the 6th place is far enough behind where it's not worth me trying to speed up at all. I'll just ride this out through the end. That's definitely a experiential thing. But it's also just different than a online qualifier setting, because every single rep, every single second is going to have like multiple people for the open.
One of the things I've always found is that the first time I get someone to qualify for a sanctional or a regional, when those were a thing, man, they always did pretty poorly at the live event the first time. And it's like there were just so many sets of competitor skills that they needed to develop that they hadn't been able to develop because they hadn't been at that level yet. That the next time they came around, that's when they kind of came out of their shell and they were able to open up a little bit. But it's almost like they just don't even know. Like they're so focused on what is going on around them, the crowd, the cameras, the judge, the fact that they're getting beat by like 8 people out of 10 in the field at that time. Like those are all things that they experience, and they have to experience that once to be able to learn to like go back into their zone. They're great qualifier athletes, right? Because that's how they got there, but they hadn't developed all the competitor skills that were necessary to go use all that online qualifier fitness in a live event scenario.
Yeah. I'm curious, did your background in swimming, how well does that carry over to competing in something like the Masters Collective? Yeah, the one that you won recently, by the way.
It's hard to say how much that was influenced by my swimming background. I mean, I can't say that it wasn't, but I also competed in CrossFit for 5 years. I went to 5 regionals, and so I'd been in all those kind of live game day scenarios. I will say that I think my competitive swimming experience made it easy to transition into CrossFit and some of the live events and sort of the gaming of it as well. Like knowing that I didn't need to win this event, that I could take second, that the 5 points wasn't worth the extra kick at the end, or maybe it was worth the extra kick at the end. That made it easy from my 2012 to 2013 regional experience to like take the ass kicking that I received at the 2012 and turn that into a much better finish in 2013. But I would say more than my swimming experience, I think my experience of working with and coaching and helping athletes navigate the sanctional and regional experience myself as a coach allowed me to use all those lessons that I was helping them learn to navigate my own competitive experience as a Masters athlete this past summer. There were plenty of events where I could have gotten into a foot race, but I knew, I was like, well, I have a 25-point lead. It's not worth the 5 points right now. Like this is going to cost me more in my subsequent event than is worth for the 5 points right now. Win the next event, take the 5-point loss.
Yeah. And if you're really freaking out in that scenario, you can't think that way. Like you're just not able to even process.
Yeah, you're just caught in the race versus being able to cognitively think like, all right, this is one it's not worth me, putting on the afterburners right now.
Yeah, really good stuff. Final question for you here. If we have a person listening, let's say this person wants to grow specifically a remote coaching business for themselves, where they want to get on more clients, maybe want to do this as a part-time thing in addition to coaching classes, or they just want to make that their full-time gig. What would be your number one piece of advice for them to grow their coaching business?
Well, I think the number one thing that I would do is try and learn from people who have done it. So I think the best way to do that and yes, I'm probably biased, but I think the best way to do that is to join the Training Think Tank classroom. First off, we've got educational material now that will literally walk you through the process of it. I created a series called Becoming a Remote Coach, right? That walks you through every step of the process of getting started as a remote coach. I have a series that's Getting Started with a Client that walks you through, literally we put a camera and filmed an entire consult. And then I walked through my thought process of how I took the consult and turned that into the first training progression. And then we've even got stuff that's like training a client with spreadsheets. If you don't know how to use I'll say this, if you're trying to get into remote coaching and you don't know how to use a spreadsheet, good luck with your organization as your client load grows. Like you're not going to do it in Google Docs. So
it'll be a disaster.
It'll be a major, I did that when I first started. I was like, I've got to transition. So I got this whole series on using spreadsheets to coach, right? To me, that's like a 3-part, like now you're ready to coach type series. But the other aspect of the classroom, it's tiered, right? So you've got, here's you getting started all the way up to how Max coached Noah leading into the CrossFit Games this past year. And then we support that with our coaching forum, where you're pretty much free to ask a community of 450 coaches anything you want. In there, we have program design reviews. You can submit your programs to have them reviewed by people who've been doing this for 10 to 15 years, coaches who have led people to the podium at the CrossFit Games. So to me, that there really isn't another coaching community that exists like the Training Think Tank classroom. So that would be number one. Number two is to put yourself out there. If the struggle that you have is that you already have a remote coaching business and you want to grow it, then you have to put yourself out there, whether that's social media, going out and giving presentations and talks. And I wouldn't go as far as like soliciting people and be like, hey, do you want remote coaching? But I would say that the number one thing you got to do is demonstrate how you can help people, whether that's social proof, like look at these people that I have helped, or look at this, here's how I think about coaching. That's how a lot of my marketing happens, right? It's like, here are the ways that I think about helping athletes, and athletes will see that and they're like, I need that kind of help. And I think putting yourself out there and kind of creating your voice, which I think you've done a fantastic job of, creating your voice in the market, I think is the thing that will kind of allow you to start to gather some clients and gather a team underneath you.
Yeah. You almost have to create a whole structure around, basically, providing a service to people for free so that eventually they will hire you.
Yeah. I'd say it's absolutely accurate. I mean, if you think about what Training Think Tank does, right? We have the Corpus Animus podcast, which is an opportunity for people to learn from the coaches and the people that make up Training Think Tank. If you watch a Corpus Animus podcast and you jive with that, well, then you're more likely to check out some of the other stuff we've got, like the classroom or the design or some of our individual coaching. And then you're going to start checking out Chris's amazing media that he's put together on our YouTube channel. That guy is a freaking genius. But like, that's really what it is. We spend a ton of time, honestly, giving away a lot for free. I mean, in this podcast alone, I gave away a lot of secrets that we use to coach really high level athletes. But the reality is that's just like a peek under the, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not the comprehensive Kyle Ruth mind.
Yeah, that's just a little peek under, what we're actually doing. And a lot of that stuff we give away in the classroom. Like that's what we're giving away. We're giving away everything inside the class. That's what we're trying to do.
Yep. Totally agree. I will 100% back to go check out Training Think Tank Classroom. I'm a member of it. Yeah, definitely highly recommended. It's 100% helped me become a better coach. So once again, I really thank you for that. And I thank you for jumping on the show today.
For sure.
Hey, we'll have to do this again sometime, I think.
I agree. I appreciate it. This was awesome.
Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.